You don't belong here. Get the hell out before I throw you out myself. The officer's voice cut through the air like a blade, thick with authority, drenched in arrogance. The courtroom, once a space of order and law, had been turned into his personal domain, a place where his word was final, where his badge granted him absolute power. He stood tall, his uniform pristine, his belt heavy with the weight of weapons meant to enforce, intimidate, dominate. His presence demanded obedience, submission. And right now, he was focused on one thing, removing the black woman standing in front of him. His eyes swept over her, and he didn't like what he saw. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't scrambling to leave, to get out of his sight like so many others before her had done. She was still. Too still. The kind of stillness that irritated him, that challenged him. In his world, people like her, the ones he had decided weren't worthy of respect, should know their place. They should step aside, lower their gaze, move when he said move. But she didn't. She just stood there. His grip tightened on his belt. I don't have time for this. I said get out. Nothing. His nostrils flared. He wasn't used to being ignored, wasn't used to being questioned. His badge meant he didn't have to explain himself, didn't have to be polite, didn't have to treat her with dignity. She was wasting his time. Are you deaf? His voice rose, sharp, aggressive. Or just stupid? Still, no movement. His patience snapped like a brittle twig. Before anyone could process what was happening, before she could even brace herself, his boot, heavy, polished, and unyielding, swung forward and slammed into her ribs. A gasp tore from her lips as the impact knocked the air from her lungs. She stumbled back, one hand shooting out to grip the wooden bench beside her, steadying herself before she could fall. The room went deathly silent. Not a sound. The kind of silence that wasn't just quiet, it was thick, suffocating, charged with something dangerous. A cough from the back. The quiet shuffle of feet. Someone swallowed hard. The bailiff shifted, but he didn't speak. The stenographer's fingers twitched above the keys, frozen. But no one moved. No one spoke. And that, more than anything, proved what they all already knew, this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. It was just the first time it had happened to the wrong person. The officer exhaled sharply, straightening his uniform. He had done worse. Much worse. To people like her. People who didn't belong. People who didn't respect authority. This was nothing. You're lucky I don't throw you in cuffs, he sneered, eyes blazing with contempt. His voice was laced with something sinister, something that had been built over years of unchecked power. Disrespecting an officer. What the hell were you thinking? She didn't answer. She didn't defend herself. She didn't argue. Instead, she lifted her head. Slowly. Deliberately. And looked at him. And for the first time since this began, since he had stormed into her courtroom, since he had spat his orders, since he had kicked her like she was nothing, he felt it. The shift. The air in the room felt different. Heavier. And then she spoke. One word. Sharp. Commanding. Bailiff. A chill ran through the space. Something cracked in the atmosphere, like a pressure drop before a storm. The bailiff, who had remained still, silent, watching everything unfold, straightened. The officer frowned. His brows pulled together in confusion. What the hell was going on? And then she said the words that shattered his world. Take him into custody. The reaction was instant. The bailiff moved. The stenographer's fingers froze. A hushed gasp spread like wildfire through the room. The officer's brain struggled to catch up. His heart slammed against his ribs. His breath caught in his throat. What the hell did you just say? His voice wasn't as strong now. The silence around him wasn't submission anymore. It was something else. Something dangerous. Something final. His feet felt glued to the ground. His body, so used to being in control, suddenly felt powerless. And then, finally, it hit him. Like a slow, crawling sickness, realization sank into his bones. The woman he had just kicked across the courtroom. The woman he had humiliated, insulted, treated like she was nothing. She wasn't just another black woman in the wrong place. She wasn't a defendant. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't a spectator. She was the judge. And the moment that truth settled into his mind, when he finally understood what he had done, his world collapsed. His face drained of color. His lips parted, but no words came out. And the courtroom, the very same place he had ruled with arrogance and unchecked power, now belonged to her. His power, his badge, his uniform, none of it could save him now. Because in that moment, as the handcuffs snapped around his wrists, there was one undeniable, unshakable truth: now, he was the one who didn't belong. Before we begin this powerful story, we want to take a moment to address something important. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in any form. No one should ever be judged or mistreated because of the color of their skin. This story is a reminder that justice always finds a way, no matter how much power someone thinks they have. To every black viewer watching, we see you, we hear you, and we stand with you. Your voice matters. Your existence matters. Now, get ready for a story full of twists, karma, and justice. If you believe in the message behind it, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because here, we tell the stories that need to be told. Enjoy the story. The air in the courthouse was thick with the weight of expectation, a quiet tension that clung to the polished wooden benches and stretched high into the domed ceiling. The grand architecture, designed to reflect the weight of justice and authority, seemed almost suffocating in its coldness. The courtroom, though largely empty before the morning session, hummed with a barely perceptible energy, a space that had witnessed countless rulings, shattered lives, and desperate pleas. Some people entered these walls hoping for fairness. Others walked in already knowing the system wasn't built for them. For Judge Amara Whitmore, this space was both her battlefield and her sanctuary. Every morning, as she stepped through the courthouse doors, she carried the weight of expectations, the knowledge that her very presence in this position was an act of defiance. A black woman in one of the highest seats of justice in the state of Louisiana, it wasn't something the world had prepared her for. But she had made herself ready. Her robes carried an unspoken challenge to every person who had ever doubted her. To every professor who had assumed she wasn't the sharpest in the class. To every opposing attorney who had mistaken her measured silence for ignorance. To every law school colleague who had smiled too politely, their disbelief barely veiled. She had spent years proving that she belonged in this courtroom. That she had earned her place. That she was not here to ask permission, she was here to rule. But today, as she entered through the private hallway that led to her chambers, something felt off. She had spent years perfecting the art of listening, to the nuances in people's voices, to the unspoken shifts in courtroom energy. But today, it wasn't just a shift. It was something heavier, something colder. She paused at her desk, glancing over at the files stacked neatly beside her nameplate. The case of the day was an important one, a hearing that would decide whether or not a high-profile case of police brutality would proceed to trial. The details were sickening, yet familiar. A black teenager, unarmed, gunned down in what the officer claimed was self-defense. The entire community had been shaken by the case, protests rippling through the city, demanding justice. And now, it was on her desk. A deep breath. A steadying exhale. This wasn't new. She had presided over many cases like this, some that led to real accountability, others where the system, a system never meant to protect people like her, closed ranks to protect its own. There was a knock at the door. Judge Whitmore, court is about to begin." She nodded, pushing the lingering unease aside. "Time to work." Outside the courtroom doors, Officer Daniel Cargill adjusted his uniform, his movements stiff with impatience. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, polished to perfection, a symbol of the power he had worn for the past 15 years. The courthouse was familiar to him, but not in the way it was to lawyers or judges. He didn't sit in front of juries, didn't argue cases. His role was simpler, more absolute. He was here to enforce. To keep people in line. He had seen enough in his years to know how this place worked. He had walked men in chains through these halls, seen their faces, sometimes resigned, sometimes furious, sometimes just empty. It didn't bother him. The system was what it was. And he was just doing his job. At least, that's what he told himself. His fingers flexed against his belt as he surveyed the hallway. His eyes naturally gravitated towards certain people, those he deemed out of place. The ones who looked like they didn't belong in a courthouse unless they were in trouble. It was a skill he had honed over the years, picking them out. The ones who walked too confidently. The ones who held their heads too high. And then he saw her. A black woman, standing near the defendant's bench. Alone. Dressed in a simple, dark outfit. Her posture was steady, composed, too composed. She wasn't looking around nervously like most people in court did. She wasn't avoiding eye contact. Something about her irritated him. She wasn't supposed to be standing there like that. He made his way over, each step deliberate, slow. "You lost." His voice carried the weight of authority, of expectation, expecting her to step back, to apologize for existing in a space she clearly shouldn't be in. She didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't react the way he wanted. His patience thinned. "I asked you a question." His voice hardened, eyes narrowing. "You're not supposed to be in here. Move along before I make you." Still, no movement. A slow smirk curled at the corner of his mouth. This wasn't new. He had dealt with plenty of mouthy ones before. The ones who thought they could challenge him, thought they could act like they weren't beneath him. He enjoyed reminding them. "I said move," he growled, stepping closer, towering over her. Nothing. No flinch. No fear. That pissed him off. Before he even fully processed what he was doing, before he could register the tension in the room, before anyone had a chance to speak, his boot was in motion. A sharp, brutal kick to the ribs. A gasp, her body jerking from the impact. A sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind him. Then, silence. A silence that didn't feel like submission. A silence that wasn't the usual kind he was used to. His smirk deepened. "There. Now you understand how this works," he muttered, rolling his shoulders, adjusting his uniform as if nothing had happened. Then, finally, she moved. Not in the way he expected. Not with fear. She straightened. Slowly. Purposefully. And then, she looked at him. And for the first time since this started, he felt it. The shift. The wrongness of it all. The way the air felt different. The way everyone was staring. A slow, creeping sensation ran up his spine, ice spreading beneath his skin. And then, she spoke. A single word. One that shattered everything. "Bailiff." His smirk faltered. His heart lurched. And as the weight of what he had done began to settle, a realization clawed its way into his mind. This woman. This woman he had just assaulted. This woman he had humiliated. This woman he had treated like she was nothing. She wasn't a visitor. She wasn't a defendant. She wasn't a nobody. She was Judge Amara Whitmore. And at that moment, as her eyes bore into his, he understood something with absolute, terrifying clarity: he had just destroyed his own life. The silence in the courtroom was no longer just silence, it was thick, heavy, filled with something unspoken but unmistakable. The weight of it pressed into the air, pressing into Officer Daniel Cargill's chest, clawing at the edges of his certainty. For the first time in his 15 years wearing that uniform, he felt something unfamiliar, something he couldn't immediately shove down or shake off. Doubt. Judge Amara Whitmore stood there, still, unflinching, the echo of her command, sharp, authoritative, still hanging in the air. Bailiff. One word. But it had shifted everything. Daniel blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. He had walked into this courtroom just like he had hundreds of times before. He had done what he always did, established control. Put people in their place. That's what his job was, wasn't it? Except now, the control he had so effortlessly wielded, was slipping. The bailiff, a man Daniel had known for years, moved. Not toward the woman. Toward him. Daniel's body tensed. What the hell is this? His voice was rough, but there was something underneath it now, something almost uncertain. His eyes darted to the faces around him, searching for reassurance, agreement, anything that told him he still held the authority in this room. No one spoke. No one moved to back him up. And Judge Whitmore? She was watching him like she already knew exactly how this was going to end. His chest rose and fell sharply. This is a mistake, he snapped, straightening his posture, forcing himself back into control. I don't know what game you think you're playing, but you're gonna regret trying to pull. Judge Whitmore's voice cut through his. Officer Cargill, do you know what assaulting a sitting judge in her own courtroom means? The words hit like a hammer. Daniel's stomach tightened. His mouth opened, but no words came. His badge. His uniform. His years on the force. They had always protected him. But something told him, deep in his bones, that none of it would protect him now. The tension in the room was suffocating. The bailiff took another step forward. Daniel took a step back. This is bullshit, he spat, his voice cracking just slightly. I thought she was a. Judge Whitmore's eyes sharpened. You thought I was what? Her voice was low, even, dangerously calm. His pulse pounded. You thought I was some random black woman? A defendant? Someone beneath you? Daniel's throat tightened. You didn't ask for my name, she continued, stepping forward now, her presence demanding the space. You didn't ask for my credentials. You didn't even try to talk to me. The moment you saw me standing here, you assumed I didn't belong. And when I didn't move fast enough, you kicked me. His jaw clenched. That's not, I didn't. Judge Whitmore turned slightly, addressing the silent crowd in the courtroom. I want everyone here to remember this moment. I want every person in this room to ask themselves, if I hadn't been the judge, if I had been any other black woman standing in this courtroom today, would there have been justice for what just happened to me? A murmur rippled through the onlookers. The whisper of uncomfortable truths settling in. Daniel's skin burned. This is a setup, he hissed, voice shaking with something dangerously close to panic. You're trying to make an example out of me. I was doing my job. Judge Whitmore tilted her head. Your job. Her voice carried no amusement. Tell me, Officer Cargill. Is kicking black women in courtrooms part of your job description? His throat went dry. The click of a pen somewhere in the room sounded louder than it should. The bailiff took another step. Daniel felt it now. The inevitability. He had controlled rooms like this for years. Owned spaces like this. Walked into them knowing no one would dare challenge him. But now. Now, he was trapped in his own arrogance. Judge Whitmore straightened, her presence commanding, unyielding. This is not just a personal matter. This is not just about me. Her voice filled the room, undeniable, inescapable. This is about the fact that men like you think they can do this and walk away. That a black woman standing in a place of power is so unthinkable to you that your first instinct was to tear her down. Daniel felt the weight of every eye in the room. The lawyers. The court clerks. The security officers he had worked with. No one spoke for him. No one moved for him. For the first time in his life, he felt what it was like to be on the other side. Judge Whitmore exhaled, long and slow. "Take him out of my courtroom." Daniel's breath hitched. The bailiff reached for the handcuffs. His handcuffs. The ones he had snapped onto countless wrists. His pulse pounded. "This is a mistake." His voice was louder now, bordering on desperate. I'll lose my job over this. You can't do this." Judge Whitmore's gaze didn't waver. "You should have thought about that before you put your hands on me." The bailiff grabbed his wrist. Daniel jerked back instinctively, panic clawing up his throat. "Don't touch me." A bitter irony. Because how many people had he said that to? How many people had he restrained while they begged for space, for breath, for dignity? Now, it was his turn to be on the receiving end. The realization was suffocating. The shame, the humiliation, it burned. And then, a voice from the back of the room cut through the chaos. A journalist. "Judge Whitmore, do you have any comment on this?" She turned to the cameras, the weight of history settling on her shoulders. "Yes," she said, clear and unwavering. "The world is going to see exactly what happened here today." And for the first time in his life, Officer Daniel Cargill had no control over what happened next. The weight of the cuffs around Daniel Cargill's wrists felt heavier than they should have, heavier than they had ever felt when he had placed them on someone else. The cold bite of steel against his skin sent a sharp, unsettling shiver through him, his breath coming shallow, his chest rising and falling with barely contained panic. His whole body felt tense, rigid, as if his very existence was rejecting this reality. But no matter how many times his mind tried to convince him that this wasn't happening, that this was impossible, the pressure around his wrists was a constant reminder that he was trapped. His eyes darted wildly around the courtroom, searching for someone, anyone, who might intervene, who might stop this insanity before it went too far. The other officers, his colleagues, his so-called brothers in uniform, stood still, unmoving, their faces unreadable. Not one of them stepped forward. Not one of them made a move to stop this. It didn't make sense. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had walked into this courthouse 100 times, 1,000 times, always with his head high, always with the confidence of a man who belonged. He had ruled these hallways with his presence alone, never once having to question his place. Now, standing at the front of the courtroom with the judge he had kicked staring directly at him, everything had changed. Judge Amara Whitmore's expression was unreadable, her gaze steady, her presence commanding in a way that made the entire room seem to shrink. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't angry. She was simply holding him accountable in a way that he had never imagined possible. "This is insane," Daniel muttered under his breath, his voice rough, hoarse, but filled with something raw. Desperation. The bailiff's grip on his arm tightened, pulling him forward. His feet felt glued to the ground, his body resisting every step, but it was useless. He was powerless here, in a way that sent a deep, unfamiliar fear into his gut. His head snapped toward Judge Whitmore. "You can't do this," he spat, his voice laced with disbelief, with rage bubbling beneath the surface of his panic. Her expression didn't waver. "You assaulted a judge in her own courtroom. Do you think there are no consequences for that?" Daniel let out a sharp breath, shaking his head, his thoughts racing, scrambling for something, anything that could make this stop. "I didn't know," he started, his voice uneven, the edges of his control fraying. "You didn't know what?" Judge Whitmore asked, stepping forward, her gaze pinning him in place. "That I was the judge. That I was someone you couldn't just kick and walk away from." His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. "That's not, I didn't," because let's be honest, Officer Cargill, she continued, her voice sharp as a blade. If I hadn't been a judge, if I had been just another black woman standing here today, would you be facing any consequences at all? Silence. The weight of her words sank into him, deep and undeniable. His breathing grew uneven, his hands clenched into tight fists against the metal cuffs. You're trying to ruin me, he snapped, his voice carrying the heat of desperation. You're trying to destroy my career. Judge Whitmore didn't blink. You destroyed your own career the moment you put your hands on me. His stomach twisted. The truth in those words clawed at him, wrapping around his ribs like a vice, squeezing. His career. His entire life. Everything he had built, everything he had stood on, was crumbling right in front of him. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. A ripple of murmurs passed through the courtroom. Someone's phone was up, recording. Others followed. The weight of the moment wasn't just in this room anymore. The world was watching. Daniel's breath hitched. His body tensed even further. You think this is justice? His voice cracked slightly, something unsteady creeping into it. You think this is gonna change anything? The department won't let this happen. They'll back me. They won't let this stand. Judge Whitmore tilted her head slightly, the movement slow, deliberate. Then I hope you're ready for the world to see exactly what your department stands for. His blood ran cold. The cameras. The people watching. This wasn't just a courtroom matter anymore. This wasn't something that could be swept under the rug. The entire world was about to see him fall. The bailiff pulled him forward, his body jerking slightly as if his instincts were still screaming at him to fight back, to do something, but what could he do? His power was gone. His voice didn't hold weight here. Not anymore. His own colleagues wouldn't even look at him. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and suddenly, he was being pulled into the blinding chaos of flashing cameras, reporters shouting, microphones shoved forward. The voices hit him like a wall. Officer Cargill, do you have a statement? Do you regret your actions? Judge Whitmore, what's the next step in this case? Judge Whitmore stepped forward, her voice clear, strong, carrying over the noise like it had been built for moments like this. The next step is accountability, she said. Daniel's stomach dropped. His legs felt weak, his mind spiraling into places he didn't want to go. The bailiff kept moving him forward. No escape. No turning back. He had walked into this courtroom thinking he was untouchable. Now he was just another man in cuffs. And the whole world was about to watch him fall. The flashing lights of the cameras were relentless, flickering in a chaotic rhythm that seemed to sync with the pounding of Daniel Cargill's heartbeat. The courthouse steps stretched before him like an execution walk, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, suffocating, dragging him into a reality he couldn't comprehend. He had walked these same steps dozens, maybe hundreds of times before, but never like this. Never in handcuffs. Never with every single eye watching him fall. The noise around him was deafening, shouts, chants, questions being hurled in rapid-fire succession, microphones thrust into his face, reporters pushing forward, desperate to capture every ounce of his disgrace. His pulse pounded in his ears, and his breath came in uneven, ragged bursts. His body felt hot, his skin burning under the weight of the moment, yet his blood ran cold. The reporters had already turned on him. He could see it in their eyes, in the way they looked at him now. Not as an officer. Not as a man who had once stood tall in his uniform, commanding authority. No, now he was just a criminal. A disgrace. A walking headline. He tried to focus, tried to make sense of the chaos, but the noise wouldn't stop. The voices crashed into him from all sides. Officer Cargill, do you believe the charges against you are fair? What do you say to those calling this a historic moment in justice? Do you feel any remorse for your actions? The words hit him like punches, each question another blow to his already collapsing world. His mouth opened, desperate to say something, anything, but nothing came. He had no answers. His tongue felt thick, useless. His mind, once so sharp, so sure, was a fog of disbelief, anger, and fear. The bailiff's grip tightened on his arm, pulling him forward. His body resisted on instinct, but the cuffs around his wrists reminded him, there was no resisting this. Judge Amara Whitmore stepped forward just slightly, her posture steady, her face unreadable, but there was something in her eyes. Something that made his stomach turn. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't reveling in his downfall. She was simply watching. Watching as justice unfolded, as the system, one that had always worked in his favor, turned against him. Daniel's throat tightened, and before he could stop himself, the words spilled out. This isn't how this is supposed to happen. His voice was low, rough, edged with something dangerously close to panic. Judge Whitmore's gaze didn't waver. No? She asked, her voice sharp, controlled. How is it supposed to happen, Officer Cargill? His jaw clenched. His chest burned. This isn't right. She tilted her head, studying him, waiting. Because it's happening to you. The words sliced through him. The reporters caught it all. His nostrils flared. His body tensed. His pulse thundered. I was doing my job, he hissed, his voice tight, raw, desperate. It wasn't personal. Judge Whitmore let out a breath, slow, measured. Not personal. Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. You kicked me in my own courtroom without hesitation. Without thought. Without a single moment of doubt. Daniel's jaw locked. His hands curled into fists against the metal cuffs, but they wouldn't budge. You didn't ask my name, she continued, stepping closer, her presence towering over him even though she wasn't physically larger. You didn't ask who I was. You didn't even ask why I was there. The moment you saw me, you assumed I didn't belong. You assumed I was someone you could treat however you wanted. Someone beneath you. The truth crushed him. He wanted to deny it. Wanted to fight back. Wanted to argue that she was twisting this, that she was making it bigger than it was, but deep down, in the space where denial couldn't reach, he knew she was right. She saw the realization flicker in his eyes, even if only for a second. You never even gave me a second thought, she said, her voice quiet now, but somehow even more powerful. But you're thinking about it now, aren't you? His breath hitched. The world around him blurred. The flashing lights, the shouting, the cameras, it all felt distant. Because in this moment, it was just him and her. Just the truth between them. And then she said the words that shattered everything. Now, you are the one who doesn't belong. His stomach dropped. The chant in the crowd grew louder, rolling through the air like a tidal wave, crashing against him from every direction. Justice for all. Justice for all. The irony burned like fire in his lungs. How many times had he ignored those very words? How many times had he turned his back on people begging for the same justice that now had him in chains? His vision blurred, his ears ringing, his world spinning. The reporters surged forward. Officer Cargill, do you have a statement? Do you regret your actions? The microphone was in his face now, the entire world waiting. He could barely breathe. His throat was tight, his chest aching. The words were right there. But they wouldn't come. For the first time in his life, he had no defense. The silence stretched. And the world saw him for exactly what he was. Not a protector. Not a man of the law. Not the one in control. Just another criminal facing justice. The doors to the courtroom shut behind him with a dull, resounding thud, sealing him in, cutting off the noise from outside, though it still lingered in his ears, in his head, in his skin. The shouts, the flashing cameras, the weight of 1,000 eyes burning into him, it was all still there, suffocating him, even as the silence of the courtroom pressed in. The air inside was heavy, dense with something unspoken, something that wrapped around him like an invisible force, squeezing, reminding him that this was real. Daniel Cargill's breathing was shallow, his pulse erratic, pounding against his ribs like a caged animal desperate to escape. His wrists throbbed from the tightness of the handcuffs locked around them, the same metal he had slapped onto countless others without a second thought. Now, the cold steel felt foreign, suffocating, an unbearable weight that he couldn't ignore, couldn't shake off, couldn't pretend wasn't there. His uniform, once a symbol of authority and respect, now felt like a costume. The badge on his chest, the one he had once worn with pride, felt like a mockery. The fabric of his shirt clung to his skin, damp with sweat, suffocating him further. He sat there, back rigid, hands useless behind him, his entire body screaming against this new reality. The courthouse had always been a place where he felt in control. He had walked these halls with confidence, with power, knowing that people stepped aside when he passed, that his presence commanded respect, fear, authority. But now, he was the one being watched. The same officers he had worked alongside for years stood in the room, their faces blank, unreadable. None of them moved to help him. None of them spoke for him. None of them even looked at him the same way. He could feel the shift, the way the ground beneath him had completely given out. For the first time in his life, he was the one people whispered about. The courtroom was still, but not in the way it normally was before a session started. This wasn't the expectant quiet of legal proceedings about to begin. No, this was different. This was a silence that carried weight, that carried judgment, that carried the understanding that nothing would ever be the same again. Judge Amara Whitmore sat at the bench, her posture composed, her expression steady, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. Her presence, calm yet unwavering, filled the space in a way that made it clear, she was in control now. Daniel's throat felt tight. His chest burned with something he couldn't define. Regret? No. Not regret. Not yet. It was something else. Something worse. Recognition. A deep, gnawing, terrifying recognition of what it felt like to be powerless. The bailiff pulled him forward, guiding him toward the defendant's table. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost clinical in the way he handled him. There was no violence, no excessive force, no cruelty, just detachment. Just routine. That, more than anything, made Daniel's stomach churn. Because for so many years, this is exactly how he had treated the people he arrested. Like paperwork. Like procedures. Like objects to be processed and moved along. And now, he was just another case. He sat, the cuffs biting into his wrists as he adjusted. The chair was uncomfortable, unfamiliar, even though he had seen hundreds of people sit in this exact spot before. But he had never imagined himself here. Had never imagined what it would feel like to be on this side of justice. His mouth was dry. His fingers twitched. His breathing was too loud in his own ears. Judge Whitmore lifted her gaze to him, her eyes sharp, steady, impossible to escape. "Officer Cargill," she said, her voice even, clear, precise, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Do you understand the severity of the situation?" Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight. Yes. She studied him for a long moment. He couldn't read her expression, couldn't tell if she was waiting for something. And then she spoke again. "Then you understand why you're here." His fingers curled into his palms, his jaw tightening. He hesitated, his voice faltering. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Judge Whitmore didn't blink. "What did you think was going to happen?" she asked, her voice calm but unrelenting. Daniel's chest tightened. The silence that followed was unbearable. Because he didn't have an answer. Not one he could say out loud. Not one that didn't make him look worse. Judge Whitmore let the silence linger, let it settle between them like an invisible weight pressing down on his shoulders. "You didn't think about what came next, did you?" she finally said. His breath hitched. The truth of it crushed him. Because she was right. He had never thought about what came after. Not for himself. Not for the people he arrested. Not for the people he hurt. He had walked through life with the unshakable certainty that there would be no consequences. That men like him didn't have to ask what happened next. That the world would always look the other way. And now? Now he was being forced to ask. And there were no answers waiting for him. Judge Whitmore exhaled slightly, as if she could see the turmoil inside him, as if she already knew what he was thinking. "Today is not your sentencing," she said, her voice steady, deliberate. "Today is your reckoning." The words sent a shiver through him. A reckoning. The word clung to him, sank into his skin, settled deep in his bones. Because this wasn't about the punishment, not yet. This was about facing the truth. And for the first time in his life, he had nowhere to run. The courthouse felt colder now, the walls stretching high above him, lined with dark wood that once gave the impression of strength, of power, of control. But now, as Daniel Cargill sat in the defendant's chair, back rigid, hands cuffed behind him, the very same walls seemed to close in, suffocating, pressing down on him, reminding him over and over again that this was real. No waking up, no undoing, no flashing of his badge to get out of this one. He had walked into this building this morning as an officer, and now he sat there as the accused. The weight of that reality settled like a boulder in his chest, crushing his ribs, making it harder to breathe. His uniform, once crisp and authoritative, now felt suffocating, the fabric clinging to him like a second skin he wanted to tear off. The badge on his chest, the very thing he had worn with pride, with certainty, with the unshakable belief that it would always protect him, felt like a joke. A cruel, twisted joke. Because now, it meant nothing. Judge Amara Whitmore sat in front of him, composed, unwavering, her presence carrying the same authority it always had, but this time, he wasn't on the right side of it. She was watching him, her dark eyes piercing through the silence, through the thick, almost unbearable tension filling the air. There was no gloating in her expression, no smug satisfaction, no enjoyment in seeing him like this. That, more than anything, made it worse. Because she didn't have to celebrate this moment to make it powerful. She just had to let it happen. The silence stretched. Long, heavy, suffocating. He had never known a silence like this before. Not in all the years he had spent patrolling these streets, walking through this courthouse, standing in this very room. He had commanded silence before. He had used it as a weapon, letting the weight of his presence force compliance, force fear, force respect. But now. Now it was being used against him. Judge Whitmore's voice, when it came, was even, measured, yet carried a weight that made his stomach churn. "Officer Cargill," she said, and just hearing his title sent a bitter twist through his gut. He wasn't sure how much longer he would have the right to it. "Do you understand why you are here today?" His throat felt tight. His pulse pounded. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice out, though it felt weaker than he wanted it to. "Yes." Judge Whitmore nodded slightly, but there was something in her expression, something searching, as if she was waiting for him to say more. To elaborate. To acknowledge. The silence stretched between them again. He clenched his jaw, trying to steady his breath, trying to keep his face neutral, but it was impossible. His body betrayed him, the tightness in his shoulders, the twitch of his fingers, the way his throat felt like it was closing up. Judge Whitmore leaned slightly forward. "I want you to think about every time you stood where I am standing now. Every time you walked into this courtroom and watched someone else take that seat. Every time you arrested someone, put them in cuffs, brought them before the law. Did you ever stop to wonder what it felt like for them?" His chest burned. His mouth opened slightly, an instinctual need to deny, to argue, to defend himself. But nothing came out. Because he knew the answer. And she did too. She let that moment sink in, let the weight of the question settle over him, let the silence force him to feel it. You never thought about it, did you? It wasn't really a question. It was a statement. His breath hitched. She exhaled, her expression unreadable. That's the problem, Officer Cargill. You never thought about it. Because you never had to. His vision blurred slightly. Not from tears. Not yet. But from the overwhelming realization sinking into his bones. For years, he had walked into this courthouse without fear. He had stood tall, knowing his place, knowing his power. He had never worried about what came next, never thought about what it felt like to be on the other side, never questioned the system that always worked in his favor. But now. Now he was in that seat. And there was no escape. Judge Whitmore let the silence breathe between them, let him feel the weight of it, let him drown in it. Then she asked the question that made his entire body go cold. What do you think would have happened if I hadn't been the judge? His breath stalled. His pulse stopped for just a moment. His fingers curled into his palms, the cuffs biting into his skin, but he barely felt it. Because the answer was already there. If she hadn't been the judge, if she had been just another black woman standing in that courtroom, dressed in something less formal, standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, he wouldn't be sitting here right now. He would be free. He would have gone home that night, taken off his boots, sat at his dinner table, slept without a second thought. And she? She would have been humiliated. She would have been hurt. She would have been dismissed. And no one would have cared. His stomach twisted violently. Judge Whitmore saw it in his face. She saw the realization hit. And for a moment, just a moment, her expression softened. Not with pity. With disappointment. That somehow made it worse. She sat back slightly. But that didn't happen, did it? His breath shuddered out of him. No. No, it hadn't. And that was why he was here now. That was why the world was watching. That was why he was sitting in the very seat he never imagined himself in. Judge Whitmore let the silence stretch again, let him sit in it, let him face it. You thought you were untouchable. His fingers tensed. You thought your badge would always protect you. His jaw locked. You thought no one would ever hold you accountable. His breath stuttered. And then she delivered the final, irrefutable truth. You were wrong. The words broke something in him. His back hunched slightly, his head dipped, the weight of it too much, too real, too big to fight. For the first time since this had started, he didn't have a defense. He didn't have an argument. Because the truth was in front of him, and he couldn't escape it. And that was what made it hurt the most. The courtroom felt impossibly vast, yet suffocatingly small at the same time. Daniel Cargill sat in the defendant's chair, wrists bound, heart hammering, his mind a battlefield of thoughts he couldn't control. The weight of everything, of his decisions, of his actions, of the moment that had shattered his world, pressed down on him with a force he couldn't escape. His breathing was uneven, his fingers twitching against the cold steel of the cuffs locked around his wrists, a sensation he had inflicted on so many others without a second thought. But now it felt different. Now it was happening to him. Judge Amara Whitmore remained seated at the bench, watching him, her eyes unflinching, steady. There was no cruelty in her gaze, no satisfaction, no personal vendetta behind her authority. That, more than anything, made his stomach churn. She wasn't reveling in this, wasn't using this as a moment of revenge. She was simply doing what had always been her job, delivering justice. And for the first time, he was on the other side of it. The courtroom had fallen into a silence so thick it was almost unbearable. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, hear the shifting of the officers standing behind him, hear the quiet, steady breath of the judge as she waited for him to absorb it all. You were wrong, she had told him. The words echoed inside his skull, bouncing against the walls of his mind, refusing to settle. He had been so certain of his place in the world. So certain that the badge he had worn would always mean something, that it would always protect him, that it would always separate him from the people he had detained, restrained, pushed down, dismissed. But now, for the first time in his life, he wasn't separate at all. He was just another man in cuffs. His throat was dry, his pulse a relentless drum beneath his skin, but when he spoke, his voice came out hoarse, rough, raw. "I didn't think," he said, the words barely a whisper. Judge Whitmore's gaze didn't shift, didn't flicker with surprise. She had known that. She had expected it. "No," she said, her voice as firm as it had been since the moment he stepped into this courtroom as a defendant. "You didn't." His chest tightened. The air in the room felt thick, pressing into him, demanding more. He wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, wanted to reach for the excuses that had always been so readily available to him. But now those words felt hollow. She tilted her head slightly, studying him, measuring his response, as if she was waiting for him to say something, something more, something real. "Tell me, Officer Cargill," she said, and he flinched at the use of his title, a title that suddenly felt fragile, temporary, meaningless. "When you looked at me that day, when you decided you had the right to put your hands on me, what was it that went through your mind?" His breath hitched. The memory flashed, unbidden. The courtroom. The moment. The way he had seen her standing there, calm, composed, unmoving. He had assumed. That was the truth of it. He had seen her, and he had assumed. Assumed she didn't belong. Assumed she was someone beneath him. Assumed she was just another person standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, another person who had no power, another person who could be dismissed, controlled, removed. His hands clenched into fists against the cuffs. His throat burned. "I thought you were. I thought you were just," he stopped, his mouth snapping shut, his pulse stuttering, because saying it out loud felt like ripping himself open. Judge Whitmore's voice was quiet but sharp, cutting through his hesitation like a blade. "You thought I was just another black woman who didn't belong." His eyes squeezed shut. The words hit too hard, too real, too undeniable. "Yes," he whispered, his voice breaking. He heard the collective shift of the room, heard the air change, felt the weight of his own admission settle in his chest like concrete. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, her elbows resting lightly on the bench, her eyes locked onto his like she was staring straight into him, into the parts of himself he had never been forced to face. "And now?" she asked. "Do you still think I don't belong?" His head snapped up, his eyes wide, burning. He didn't answer right away. He couldn't. Because the answer was too obvious. Because of course she belonged. She had always belonged. It was him who didn't. The realization cut through him, sharp and brutal. "No," he admitted, his voice raw, broken, honest. Judge Whitmore didn't gloat, didn't smile, didn't show any triumph in his confession. She simply nodded. And somehow, that made it worse. Because it meant she had never needed his admission to validate herself. She had never needed him to see her as worthy. Because she had always been worthy. She had always been more than what he had assumed her to be. But he had just learned what it felt like to have everything stripped away. Judge Whitmore straightened. "Tell me, Officer Cargill," she said, and the title sounded heavier now, filled with finality, like it was slipping from his grasp even as she spoke it. "If you had the chance to do it all over again, would you still do the same thing?" His throat tightened painfully. He thought about it. Really thought about it. Because now, he had to. And when he answered, it was with the full, unbearable weight of the truth pressing into his lungs. "No," he said, his voice barely a breath. "I wouldn't." Judge Whitmore exhaled, slow and steady. And then she said the words that changed everything. "Then I hope you're ready to prove it." His stomach dropped. His breath caught. Because those words, those 5 simple words, told him that this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. And for the first time since this all began, he understood what that meant. The courtroom doors creaked slightly as they swung open, allowing a rush of cool air to seep inside, a stark contrast to the suffocating weight that still lingered in the room. The murmurs of the spectators had settled into a hushed stillness, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting, watching, absorbing the magnitude of what had just transpired. Daniel Cargill remained seated in the defendant's chair, the metal cuffs around his wrists digging into his skin, a constant, unrelenting reminder that his life had changed forever. Everything that had once defined him, his uniform, his badge, the authority he had wielded without question, was gone. It wasn't just a job that had been taken from him, it was his entire identity. The weight of that realization settled deep in his bones, pressing into his chest like a force he couldn't escape. The very institution that had once protected him, had once given him the confidence to act without fear of consequence, had turned its back on him. No, not turned its back. It had finally seen him for what he truly was. The badge had once been his shield, his power, his immunity. But it had never made him a good man. It had only given him the illusion of being untouchable. That illusion was now shattered. Judge Amara Whitmore remained at the bench, her presence unshaken, her posture as steady as it had been from the beginning. She had fought this battle before, had seen the system fail too many times, had watched men like Cargill walk away unscathed. But not this time. This time, the system had done what it was supposed to do. It had held him accountable. She watched him closely, not with gloating, not with triumph, but with finality. This wasn't about vengeance. This was about justice. The ruling was clear. Daniel Cargill had lost his badge. He would never wear the uniform again. His name, once spoken with respect by his colleagues, would forever be associated with disgrace, with shame, with the undeniable proof that power unchecked leads to destruction. He would serve time, not the maximum, but enough. Enough for the world to see that the rules had changed, that there was no longer room for men like him to escape judgment. The gavel struck. The sound was final, reverberating through the courtroom like a closing door, like a chapter that had just ended with no chance of rewriting. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry, his body tense, his entire world a blur of consequences he had never once imagined facing. He had spent years believing that men like him didn't get caught, didn't get punished, didn't lose. But now he was proof that even the untouchable can fall. The officers moved toward him, but he didn't resist. There was nothing left to fight for. The moment the gavel came down, the battle had already been lost. And yet, Judge Whitmore wasn't done. She spoke one final time, her voice firm, steady, cutting through the air like the last piece of truth he would have to accept. "Mr. Cargill," she said, and hearing his name without his title sent another painful ripple through his chest. "Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about change. The question isn't whether you regret what you did, it's whether you will choose to be different because of it." Her words hung in the air, stretching across the distance between them, filling the room, filling him. For the first time, he didn't have an answer. And maybe that was the point. The cameras were still rolling, the world outside still waiting, but inside the courtroom, it was just him and the truth. Daniel Cargill had always believed that the law existed to protect men like him. That as long as he wore his uniform, as long as he carried himself with confidence, as long as he followed the unspoken rules that had been set in place long before him, he would always be safe. But the truth was, the law had never been his to manipulate. The law had finally caught up to him. As he was led out of the courtroom, the weight of the cameras flashing, the voices shouting, the judgment of the world following his every step, he understood something he had never once considered. He wasn't special. He wasn't different. He wasn't immune. He was just another man who had finally faced the consequences of his own actions. And no badge in the world could save him now. Judge Whitmore sat in her chambers after the trial, her hands resting on the desk, the echo of the gavel still ringing in her ears. She had won this battle, but she knew it was only one step in a much larger fight. There would always be another case. Another name. Another injustice waiting to be confronted. But today the system had worked. Today, the world had seen that power unchecked could be brought to its knees. And that was a victory worth remembering. Now, let me ask you something. What does justice really mean? Is it about punishment, or is it about change? Did Daniel Cargill truly learn his lesson, or was he just another man who never expected to get caught? Would he have thought twice if the roles had been reversed, if he had been the one standing in Judge Whitmore's place that day? And more importantly, how many more like him still walk free? Justice isn't just about one case, one verdict, one man losing his badge. It's about breaking the cycle. It's about making sure that power is never unchecked again. Do you think justice was served today? Or do you believe this was just one battle in a war that is far from over? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe in stories that challenge you, stories that leave you questioning, stories that show the truth no matter how uncomfortable it is, then make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because justice isn't just a word. It's a reckoning.